Oh, what's up, everybody? Welcome. Today's gonna be a different kind of a video. First off, it's been quite a while since I've posted anything. Been working, taking care of my family, all the adulting stuff like that. But also, I'm trying to make this video several times already. What started as a movie retrospect and turned into a deep dive, turned into a rabbit hole that just went deeper and deeper. So, this movie, The Fisher King, was released in 1991. It was directed by Terry Gilliam. It stars Jeff Bridges, Robin Williams, Mercedes Ruehl, Amanda Plummer, and Michael Jeter. It is a story about trauma, narcissism, love, redemption, and escape from trauma through fantasy. Fantasy inspired by mythology. Now, as the great psychologist Carl Jung had often stated various ways in his writings, mythology is like our dreams. It connects us to our subconscious. The greatest myths always have embedded within them the answer to the lesson in which it presents. The movie itself references the mythology of the Fisher King and Parsifal, the innocent fool who saves him. Nobody analyzes it better than Robert A. Johnson in his seminal work He, and he quotes saying, "The Grail myth speaks directly to our psyche, and in particular to the development of the masculine in both men and women." And this is as relevant now as it's ever been. The Fisher King was released in theaters in 1991. It is directed by Terry Gilliam. It stars Jeff Bridges, Robin Williams, Mercedes Ruehl, Amanda Plummer, and Michael Jeter. It tells the story of a radio shock jock who tries to find redemption by helping a man whose life he inadvertently shattered. Jeff Bridges' character, Jack Lucas, is a narcissistic, misanthropic radio DJ whose insensitive on-air comments inadvertently prompt an unstable caller to commit a mass murder-suicide at an upscale Manhattan restaurant. Now, before learning of the tragedy, Jack is in a state of complete self-absorption. Rehearsing lines for a potential part on a crappy television sitcom, the director notes in the DVD commentary that this is intentional. At the beginning of this character's arc, he is so sure of himself and so completely self-centered, he's reached a state of success that leaves him not only detached from the real world, but furthered into an unchecked state of overconfidence. And when it gets to the point where he's putting skin cream on his face, it is to represent a peak of manic delirium caused by self-absorption, repeating the lines over and over.
Hey, forgive me.
The line itself kind of works as a precursor or a foreshadowing of his actions and justifications, and it ultimately becomes the essential lesson he must learn in order to overcome his own personal struggles. Now, flash forward 3 years and Jack is a broken man, living with his girlfriend Anne, played by Mercedes Ruehl, in an apartment above her video rental store. He's drunk and bitter and still very self-absorbed. He leaves and he wanders the city. When he's wandering the city, he's given a wooden Pinocchio doll by a little boy. The significance of the Pinocchio doll is to symbolize change. Like Pinocchio turning from a wooden puppet into a real boy, there are certain trials and tribulations one must go through in order to change for the better, or in this aspect, become more real. Jack Lucas has lived an insulated life. At the peak of his success, that's what he had. And from his bubble, he shouted unapologetic, know-it-all antidotes and triggering half-cocked ideas of how people should lead their lives. What he saw as a power became his downfall. What may seem like a strength in the moment is in fact a weakness. And like all weakness unaddressed, it becomes worse and worse over time. You see, when you reach for something that you aren't ready for yet, it becomes something you can't live with or can live without. This isn't unlike the story of the Fisher King himself, Amfortas, the king of the Grail castle of medieval lore, whose story begins as a boy sent into the woods overnight to prove his courage when he happens upon a fire. In some versions of this story, it's a piece of salmon cooking on the fire that he reaches for and burns his hand, and in others, it's a vision of the Holy Grail itself. In the version, when he burns himself reaching for the salmon, he puts his fingers in his mouth to nurse his wound and gets a bit of salmon in his mouth, which tastes so delicious that he can't untaste it. In another version, the one that's referenced in the movie, he sees in the fire the Holy Grail itself and hears a voice call out, "You shall be keeper of the Grail, and you shall seek to heal the hearts of man." But he had greater ideas of power and prestige, and he reached for the Grail, burning his hand. Now, in the first version mentioned, he becomes keeper of the Grail, but is forbidden to drink from it. And in the later version, the Grail disappears and he spends most of his life searching for it to heal his wound. In some versions, he's not even burned. He's pierced in the thigh by the tip of a spear. But in every version, he's forced to live with his wound that never heals, and the only thing he can do to take his mind from it, from the pain, is to fish. Hence the name the Fisher King. The Fisher King wound, in psychological terms, is a common condition for Western man, where every young man, as Jungian analyst Robert A. Johnson notes, has naively blundered into something that is too big for him. He proceeds halfway through his masculine development and then drops it as being too hot. Often, a certain bitterness arises, because, like the Fisher King, he can neither live with this new consciousness he has touched, nor can he entirely drop it. The wound, however, is crucial for the development of consciousness, for its redemption through the intercession of Parsifal. It's what leads to a complete integration of the self. It's what leads to a life of self-awareness, contentment, passion, and authenticity. And same in the movie. Jack can no longer live with his success, nor can he live with the knowledge of the calamity his words have brought. He heads down to the docks to commit suicide, where he gets jumped by a couple privileged thugs who intend to set him on fire, when he is saved by a homeless Robin Hood-like character and his merry men of drunk singing hobos. So, we soon learn that Robin Williams' character is a man who suffered great tragedy. The same tragedy, in fact, that ended Jack's career. Before losing his wife, Robin Williams' character was a college professor who specialized in Grail lore. In order to cope with, or really block out this terrible trauma, he reinvents himself as Perry, a noble knight of King Arthur's Round Table, on a mission to retrieve the Holy Grail, Perry being short for Parsifal. The story of Parsifal is part of the medieval legend of King Arthur and the quest for the Holy Grail. The Grail myth itself dates back to at least 12th century in Europe. It's been transmitted in various versions, including French from the poet Christian de Troyes, which was the first. This is actually the farthest back written that we can find, but that's not to say these stories weren't passed down from generation to generation before it was ever put on paper. There's the English version by Thomas Malory, which was written almost 200 years later, and a lot of stuff had been added and elaborated to the story since that. And there's the German version, Wolfram von Eichenbach's version, which became the basis for Richard Wagner's famous Parsifal opera. Now, as Robert A. Johnson notes in his book He, every adolescent receives his Fisher King wound. He would never proceed into consciousness if it were not so. The Church speaks of this wound as the Felix Copa, the happy fall which ushers one into the process of redemption. So, according to tradition, there are potentially 3 stages of psychological development for a man. The archetypal pattern is that one goes from the unconscious perfection of childhood to the conscious imperfection of middle life, to conscious perfection of old age. One moves from an innocent wholeness in which the inner world and the outer world are united to a separation and differentiation between the inner and outer worlds, with an accompanying sense of life's duality, and then, at last, to enlightenment, a conscious reconciliation of the inner and outer in harmonious wholeness. Now, in the movie, Jack begins to think that if he can help Perry in some kind of way, maybe things would turn around for him. Jack begins to believe, in some way, that he can find some kind of redemption, both for himself and his career. If he can find a way to help this man who he feels responsible for. He decides that if he can help Perry meet his fair maiden, the girl he's admired from afar, that he would be able to find some sort of redemption himself. So Perry also reveals to Jack that he is in love with his fair maiden, a quirky, offbeat, kind of lonely girl played by Amanda Plummer, who you might remember as the small but iconic part in Pulp Fiction in the beginning and end, Honey Bunny. She's in a ton of other movies too. So I Married an Axe Murderer. Jack begins to believe and convinces his girlfriend Anne, played by Mercedes Rule. She actually wins an Academy, a Golden Globe. Robin Williams also won a Golden Globe for this, as well as Critics' Choice Awards, a bunch of other stuff. And she's an incredibly literate woman. Very different than the character she's playing in this movie. But she was able to draw from other women in her family since she grew up in New York. However, the main reason she took this role, or went out for this role in the first place, was because her college thesis was on the Fisher King, the mythology of the Fisher King. In his typology of the personality, Dr. Carl Jung observes that every educated person has one superior function of the four functions of feeling, thinking, sensing, and intuiting, which make up the human temperament. Also, as part of our psychology, there is an opposing inferior function. While our superior function produces most of the high value of our life, the more developed personality strengths, it also leads us into our Fisher King wound, our inferior function. That part of us which is least differentiated will heal us from that wound. So, it is the innocent fool from Wales who will heal the Fisher King. Now, Parsifal is a boy of such lowly origins that he doesn't even have a name in the beginning. Later we find that his name is Parsifal, which means innocent fool. The name also has a deeper meaning, he who draws the opposites together, and foretells his healing role, something like the meaning of the Chinese word Tao. The story also begins as a boy, raised by his mother in the outback, not knowing of his father, who was a knight, and his other brothers, who were knights, that died. And he's dazzled one day by the appearance of these 5 knights who come into his village. To his mother's dismay, he decides that he's going to seek out to be a knight himself. She agrees to let him go, but gives him a homespun garment for him to wear, which, as Robert A. Johnson notes, this represents the mother complex in psychology and will later prove costly to Parsifal and his psychological development. So, Parsifal finally makes his way to King Arthur's court, Camelot, where he is immediately ridiculed and laughed at. However, there was a prophecy that a damsel who lived in the court, who hadn't smiled or laughed in over 6 years, would burst out in laughter at the greatest knight, which she did at innocent Parsifal. And the court immediately took this seriously, held Parsifal in high regard, knighted him right on the spot. Now, Parsifal, naive, not burdened with the fear of anxiety or any of that, decides to seek out the most fearsome knight of them all, the Red Knight, a warrior that's so fierce he's never been defeated. Parsifal, as naive as he is, confronts him and asks him for his horse and armor. And laughing, he agrees, but only if Parsifal can take it himself. Predictably, Parsifal's knocked to the ground by the powerful knight. But as he fell, he pulls out his dagger and he throws it through the Red Knight's eye, killing him. Now, this victory, as Robert Johnson surmises, represents the integration. You see, the Red Knight represents the shadow side of masculinity, the negative, potentially destructive power. To truly become a man, the shadow personality must be struggled with, but it can't be repressed. The boy mustn't repress his aggressiveness since he needs it. He needs that masculine power of his Red Knight shadow to make his way through the mature world. Now, in the movie, the Red Knight appears as more of an antagonist to Perry's fantasy reality. The Red Knight usually appears every time Perry's fantasy reality is threatened by remembering the trauma that he experienced. So, this newly empowered knight goes out seeking battle and adventure, rescuing maidens and defeating opponents, but not killing them. Any knight Parsifal overcame, he instead instructs them to go and join Arthur's court and swear allegiance to him. So one day, along his quest, Parsifal encounters a man fishing in a boat, and he asks if there's a place to stay for the night. The man tells him to go down the road a bit to the left. Parsifal obliges and suddenly finds himself on the grounds of the Grail Castle. Windows gleaming, knights and ladies greeting him, the splendor of which he'd never seen or dreamed of before. A great ceremony was about to begin, one which occurred every evening. A great feast and celebration was held where maidens brought out to all assembled the Holy Grail, from which all would partake, immediately granting them whatever they desired. Everyone, that is, except for the Fisher King. Because of his agonizing wound, he was unable to drink from the Grail, and his affliction continued to wreak havoc across his kingdom. Now, just like the Grail story, reaching into the fire, and his intentions were not pure. His intentions, Jack's intentions, are still focused on regaining what he lost. Success and his career, and not just focused on helping a fellow human being. During his quest, Parsifal had encountered a mentor, Gornemond, who had instructed him in the ways of knighthood. When encountering the Holy Grail, Gornemond instructed Parsifal to ask one important question: who does the Grail serve? This was the question that would heal the Grail King's wound. However, his mother also told him not to ask too many questions, and hers was the advice Parsifal heeded at this time. All assembled knew the prophecy, and that one day an innocent fool would enter the castle and ask the question that would heal the king, all except Parsifal. Very quickly the ceremony ends, everyone retiring for the night. The next morning when Parsifal awakes, there's nobody there. When he rides out, he looks behind him and the Grail Castle disappears. This loss tormented Parsifal, and it would take years of grueling, rigorous battles and quests for Parsifal to realize that the homespun garment that he wore beneath his armor, the psychological symbol of the Mother Complex, had to be removed before he could partake of the Grail and heal the Fisher King. Parsifal spends some 20 years earning his way back to the Grail Castle. They're difficult years. However, he grows in bitterness and disillusionment. These represent the difficult years of middle age, where one begins to question one's very existence and the choices made. After 20 years of searching in vain for what was lost in his first encounter of the Grail Castle, Parsifal has had his arrogance and pride beaten and humbled. One day, along his quest, he's introduced to a forest hermit. At first, the hermit scolds him for his failures, especially for not asking the question when he's first encountered the king. However, he soon softens, sympathizing with Parsifal, and invites him to go down the road a little bit just to the left, where he returns to the Grail Castle. This time, however, Parsifal asks the question, whom does the Grail serve? The simple act of asking this question immediately heals the Grail King, and the entire castle erupts in celebration. What is the answer to the question? You, my lord, the Grail King. And what exactly does this answer mean? Very simply, we serve something far greater than ourselves. Carl Jung, the great psychologist, would say that by asking this question, one comes to the realization that the ego now comes into service of the self. You see, this is saying that the goal of life is not merely to attain personal happiness, rather it's to serve the Grail, that is, to live a life not of ego, but of our most authentic nature, our souls. As Robert A. Johnson so eloquently sums it up, one cannot pursue happiness. If he does, he obscures it. If he will proceed with the human task of life, the relocation of the center of gravity of the personality to something greater outside itself, happiness will be the outcome. What is that? Ew! What is that? What is that? Oh, it's your thumb. And as Robert A. Johnson notes, a man must consent to look to a foolish, innocent, adolescent part of himself for his cure. The inner fool is the only one who can touch his Fisher King wound.